with Christopher Cahoe, who I've known for many years. And I want to first, acknowledge the moment we're in. It's been a really difficult, past few weeks, past few months, and past few days in the Asian American community, as we've seen so many violent attacks on members of our community. And I think, conversations like this and sort of focusing on the stories and experiences of Asian Americans, I think is really important. So, so I, really just want to thank everybody for participating today, and hopefully you have some great questions at the end for Chris and I. And I want to thank Chris for doing this, and having this conversation, being so open with your experiences and your perspective. So just as a way of introduction into the program, we've been doing this since 2016, where we've talked with artists and curators, cultural producers in the community, asked them about, I think, questions that a lot of people don't ask curators and artists, which is just about their background, their childhood experiences, and then how that led into what they do now in terms of art making and curatorial work. And it's really based on our oral history tradition at MOCA. And so I think you're in for a real treat, because Chris has some, I know Chris, and I know he has a lot to share and a lot of amazing ideas. And I'm really curious to learn about, Chris, your childhood. So I want to start there to get to know you a little bit better. So tell us where you were born, where you grew up, and kind of like what your childhood was like in a sort of sketch way.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the question. And yes, thank you for asking these questions that are rarely asked in our field. So I appreciate this very much. Appreciate being able to participate in Curators in Conversation. I was born in Hong Kong at Canossa Hospital in the mid-levels. And we stayed there. My parents and I stayed in Hong Kong until about age 4, after which we bounced to Kuala Lumpur for a few years. And then after Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, we settled in Los Angeles. And so my early childhood was in Hong Kong and mostly Los Angeles until about age 14, after which I went to boarding school in Connecticut and stayed east. But throughout this time, certainly from age 4 to 14, we would, like so many diasporic Chinese families, go back and forth between Los Angeles and Hong Kong every year, twice a year, Christmas and summers. And so actually, Neil has kindly put up 3 images of a work I did in 2018 that dealt with this kind of twice annual ritual of going from Los Angeles to Hong Kong. And it was based off of a Cathay Pacific flight that I remember very well. And you probably do too, Herb.
Cathay Pacific, I'm not sure if we ever flew that airline, but we did go back, once in a while to Hong Kong, which is where I was born too. So we share that experience. I'm curious about your early memories of Hong Kong. Like, what kind of sticks out to you about being there? Was it food stuff or what about the city? Do you remember?
As a child, going back, especially during the summers, of course, I remember the heat and the humidity of Hong Kong. But also, my sister and I were so adventuresome at the time. We would explore, I think, walk by foot every kind of town and place in Hong Kong. So I just remember walking around all the buildings and exploring Hong Kong. And actually back then, something that I'm kind of embarrassed to admit now, but part of what motivated the exploration and part of my connection with Hong Kong was shopping. It was the place where I would get Bossini sweatshirts and Giordano, t-shirts.
Thank you for mentioning those two brands. That's that really made my day. Yeah.
But those were the ones that you would bring back to Los Angeles and you would wear, and they would be semi-unique, right? And now, of course, in retrospect, it all makes sense because Hong Kong is in fact such a commercial city that I think that even in childhood, I must have registered this somehow, or that kind of commercialism must have seeped in so that I would walk around going into shops, in and out of shops for the entire summer.
And in terms of Southern California, Los Angeles, what kind of community did you grow up there? Were you in a big city or were you kind of more in the suburbs? What was your experience like with LA?
Los Angeles was a little bit less exciting to me, in part because it's a car city, and even to this day, I don't drive.
Really?
But like so many, I spent like a year teaching at Cranbrook where I had to drive, and I won't get into it, but let's just say I had 3 cars because I kept on getting into minor fender benders. No one was ever hurt, but I'm just not good at it. But Los Angeles was really different. It was typically, we settled in Palos Verdes, which is a very Asian community. And I think, like so many diasporic families, we would cluster. And in fact, my aunt lived down the street and, there was an uncle that was nearby. So I think for whatever reason, we chose Los Angeles and we all went there. A bunch of people are still there. A bunch of extended family are still there.
Yeah, and I mean, I've a lot of questions about LA, but just to focus a little bit more, what these years that you lived in LA 4 to 14, you said, was there any kind of sort of passion around the art making? Were you drawing? Were you painting? Were you being exposed in school to art ideas?
Some. I think that I spent 1 year in public school in Los Angeles before going to boarding school. And I was always interested in art, but I would say up until leaving for school in Connecticut, I think my knowledge in art, we weren't really a museum going family. We had like a Victor Vasarely print maybe, in the house. I think a lot of those early art years were more what I would call graphic design and illustration now, looking back.
So yeah, graphic design. I mean, I wonder how, just thinking about, I don't know, your sort of family background, your parents and how they raised you, but I think a lot of Asian Americans in the arts, grew up with this kind of, family background where art maybe was looked upon as not a serious option for a vocation or sort of future profession. And I wonder what that was like, for you and your parents. Do you think they would have been accepting of, a young Chris having ambitions to be an artist?
I do not. I do not think they would have been.
Yeah, what do they have in mind?
I'm not exactly sure what they had in mind, but probably not a career in the arts. Neil is kindly actually flipping through ahead just to keep people up to date. My high school art teacher, a couple slides back from Hotchkiss, and some very early influences. Marjorie, this wasn't taken in high school. I went back to visit her in around 2017. So this was taken in 2017. Of course, it was 20 years earlier. We were both 20 years younger. More than that when I had her in school. But she was, just to give you a little bit of background, she was a committed or a enthusiastic abstract expressionist painter herself. And her idols, which were Motherwell, Pollock, Hoffman, de Kooning, became my idols early on. So it was Abex painting that really impacted me for those late high school years. But getting back to your question, Herb, I think it's super interesting because I very clearly remember my mother telling me when I told her I wanted to be an artist that, you know, artists don't make any money. And even then, I think I was bourgeois enough. I didn't even know what that word meant, but now I would use that word. I was bourgeois enough to know that that was not necessarily the life I wanted, a poor life. So by the time I got to college, in fact, I did hedge and I ended up studying architecture. So these are also some paintings that were influenced from those early years. Neil is showing a project called Regional Painting from 2010, where I revisited my early love of painting after many decades making conceptual art. And part of
wait,
this,
these are your paintings?
these are my paintings. These
Oh, no way.
are
These
my
are amazing.
paintings from, oh, thank you. This guy,
Yeah.
I'm coming from a painter. I know you're a painter, so I appreciate that.
I'm really feeling it.
Yeah, I hadn't painted for decades when I made these, but I just wanted to revisit that early era of painting, early love of painting. And part of the project was actually moving out here where I am now in Colorado and looking at regional painting. And part of that was also this novella that I wrote about, that was semi-biographical, called Hirsch E.P. Rothko's Hirsch E.P. Rothko. And it was about a conceptual artist who revisits his early love of painting. I dedicated this to my high school art teacher, Marjorie Reed. And the kind of tagline of the book is scratch a conceptual artist, find a painter. And it's just a play off of that old saying, scratch an Englishman, find a pirate.
Huh. Wow. Yeah, I want to hear more about this project. Yeah, and it kind of speaks to how layered, your projects are, and it's great to see these paintings as kind of part of that, part of your thinking process, and this kind of recovery of like what your past experiences. Yeah, I wanted to hear also about moving to the East Coast, the kind of culture shock I can imagine that being. Could you talk a little bit about moving to the East Coast, and you mentioned boarding school and sort of like what was that experience like overall?
For me, it was a positive one. I think I needed to get out of Los Angeles and get out of my immediate family environment. And I'm lucky that that boarding school was part of at least my mother's family, and so that was a kind of more obvious option in terms of getting out and exploring the world on my own. So overall, it was positive, and certainly I appreciate meeting Marjorie Reed, Mrs. Reed, and being introduced to these artists I otherwise would not have known. And later, of course, I would see at MoMA, and I'd see in person and be very happy to see in person. So I think overall, it was a positive experience for me.
So is that in high school with Ms. Reed being your teacher, was that kind of where the idea formed? Okay, maybe, yeah, and also being near New York, is that maybe where the idea grew on you to sort of be an artist full time and to sort of really explore, the world of art and ideas?
It was.
This is not a yes or no question.
No, I think it's a really interesting question, and actually, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this, and also for the prompt to make me think about this, because of course I hadn't thought about those years in a long time. But at the time, even though I very much liked making art, I was also involved in many different ways. So I founded the Hotchkiss Art Society, still exists today,
You
and
found,
uh,
wow.
edited the review, which is the Arts and Literary magazine at Hotchkiss that has a very long history. I think Mary Chen is on this. One of your board members is on this call, but she recently did something with Tom Dolby. So the year after me, Tom Dolby, the filmmaker, ended up being the editor. And years before me, it was Louis Lapham. So I think I was involved in many ways in the field of art. And at that time, I just knew I wanted to be in the arts, not necessarily primarily making art, but to be a person who is involved in the arts.
I see. And then you mentioned architecture too is in the mix, and that's, I think, what you studied in college, right?
It is.
Talk about that, like, choosing that major and sort of how you negotiated like between architecture and your interest in art in college. What was that like?
We have, Neil has some pictures of a very well-known exhibition from Cornell University. Before my time, it was the first museum exhibition of earthworks. It included Smithson and Morris. Gordon Clark and Louise Lawler were students at the time, so they participated as students. Richard Long was part of this show. And so I think very conveniently or fortuitously, I went into architecture as a hedge because I wasn't sure if the life of being a poor artist was for me. But fortuitously, I think because site specificity had such a strong tradition at Cornell, and additionally, site specificity was just kind of coming to the fore as I was an undergraduate at Cornell. Mi-Wang Kwan, remember, she wrote her essay on site specificity in 1997, the original essay that spawned the book. So that gives you a sense of how current cited work was. So conveniently, I was in an architecture program, but at a school where there was a long tradition of site-specific work. And then in the art world at the time, on the right, we see Daniel Joseph Martinez's intervention at Cornell's Quad from 1993. So this was while I was at Cornell, which for those who don't remember, is a precedent to a lot of the sit-ins that are happening today. He erected these giant walls at Cornell's Quad. They were defaced, they were defended. It was kind of our mini tilted arc scenario, and it ended up with a lot of Latinx students protesting and occupying the university president's office for a weekend or more. So, this kind of very vibrant atmosphere allowed me to pursue site-specific art while using the tools I was learning in architecture school.
Very interesting. And then wanted to talk about New York. When did you move to New York, and for what reason?
Well, one of the things, Neil, on the left-hand side is, and I know there are a couple of former students in the audience here. Stephen Truax is one of them. This is, on the left is actually my very first syllabus, my very first class I ever taught at RISD. So one of the interesting things at Cornell is I stumbled into a seminar by Hal Foster. And that was also revelatory and transformative. It was a level of kind of intellectual, until then, I think art, especially coming from Marjorie Reed and abstract expressionism, was an expressive endeavor and a formal endeavor. And I think it was kind of stumbling into Hal Foster's theory and criticism seminar that also showed me that art could be an incredibly rich intellectual endeavor. And the first text that he assigned that very first week in 1993 or 4 was Michael Fried's Art and Objecthood. And I remember not understanding a word of the thing, having to read it 3 times. And honestly, I'm not even sure I understood it years later until teaching it for, it remained on my syllabus for like 5 or 6 years. And that's when I think I finally understood that text. But it's a long way of answering your question. I think that seminar made me interested in theory and criticism in art. And so moving to New York, it was less about moving to New York, but it was more about going to Columbia to further study theory and criticism with some of the other kind of October Journal people that Hal Foster was associated with at the time.
I see. And so you moved here for Columbia, moved to New York for Columbia University. And what year was this?
This was 1997. No, oh God, I'm. Are you kidding me?
You're cool.
I'm happy with being old. 1997.
Okay. And yeah, what was your impression of New York? Was, coming to Columbia, enrolling there, was that your first time in New York? And also, what was it like back then in 97, like New York in the 90s?
Well, I think you were here, you were there at the time, so you two would know. I think we met probably not that many years after I first moved to New York. For me, and I want to hear about your experience too, Herb, for me, it was an incredibly lonely experience. I moved to New York. My first year there, I didn't even have an apartment. I bounced around 6 or 7 places, like so many people, very typical New York story. And Columbia was very different than Cornell insofar as it's a city college, which means that it didn't have the kind of natural architectural landscaping that kind of allowed for collegiality between students, especially as a graduate student. So really, I felt, of course, I was excited about being in New York and seeing the artwork in galleries, but I did not have a community. In fact, when I first moved to New York, I had one art friend, Peter Rostovsky, whose slides we see here. He was a classmate at Cornell and a friend, remains a friend, and he was the only person I knew in the arts when I first moved to New York.
I mean, yeah, you raised something that I wanted to ask, which is just, how did you start forming this network? Because when I met you, I felt like you were the person who knew everybody. And so it's interesting to hear that you felt kind of isolated, actually. So, how did you start meeting people and start getting opportunities? And I also want to hear about your first exhibition experience and what that was like.
It's a great question. And the answer is very clear because I remember it very clearly. I decided about a year into my time in New York that I would take seriously and have substantive conversations with every single artist that I met, regardless of their standing, regardless of their career position, and regardless of what type of work they made. I just made sure that every single artist I encountered, I would have a real conversation and make a real connection. And so I loved hearing, Herb, that you thought I knew everyone, or by the time you knew me, you thought I knew everyone, because it was really a one step at a time type of thing in terms of expanding that. I also started curating exhibitions, and that was also really useful as a way of kind of finding a community. And this is what Neil had on screen just before. This was one of Peter's friends, Cletus Daglish-Shelmer, who's now in Los Angeles. he is one of these artists that I decided I'd have a real conversation with. We hit it off and we decided that we would curate a show.
Wow.
It was my first show. It was in my apartment. Cletus and I did it. Peter was part of it, but so was Nina Kachadorian. So was Carolyn Harris. And so, so was Andrea Ray and Carrie Tribe, which seems like hilarious now, right? This completely unfunded, zero budget apartment show that all of these people were in. I mean, this was obviously before any of them, certainly before like Pace picked any of them up. So, it was, yeah, it was, I think curating also helped me really create and find artists I respected and like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear about this transition or other side of you, I guess, which is, yeah, how did you decide, like, okay, I'm gonna start curating exhibitions? It just seems like, a very intentional idea. And how did you arrive at that?
It's a good question. The next slide that we have is actually my first. So Unpacking was the first curatorial project I did with Cletus. This Sidelong Glance was the first exhibition I partook in, curated by Omar Lopez Shahud, whom I know you know
Omar.
well, the great Omar, another incredibly impactful person in my life. And I don't know if you remember Incheon Gallery. It was a gallery founded by a Korean artist, exactly, hole in the wall in Brooklyn. And so this was at Incheon Gallery. And Omar, at the time, was also transitioning from being an artist. I don't know if you remember, he used to show in Chelsea, and he had just started kind of transitioning to becoming a curator, which he is now at Untitled. But at the time, he was kind of a model for me, for someone who managed to do both and do both very well. The next couple of slides are our first kind of large-scale curatorial project that Omar, Regine Basha, and I did up in Brewster, New York. And I think in 2001, this was either 2000, 2001, 2002, it was a multi-year project where we worked with the town to commission and locate some 70 artworks per year. And I'm pretty sure there are some Brewster people, Perry, Hugh, I think is in the audience, a couple of Brewster people who are in the audience today. And I've kept in touch with many of them. Pablo, I mean, this is Pablo Hoguera 20 years ago, doing his Singing Telegram piece, which recently he did again. Austin Thomas, who's now at the FIT Galleries on the right. Douglas Ross, who now teaches at Cornell on the left. He did a meditation piece in front of a travel agency. Drew Cliness on the top, Wade Guyton, whom we were talking before this presentation, was even in 2002, Too Cool for School, on the lower left. But, I think Omar really, in this case, in the Brewster Project, Omar and Regine was always a curator, is a curator. They really kind of inspired me to think about curating in really fun and inventive ways. I think the Brewster Project also, as you can tell, highlighted site-oriented practices. And there is a kind of logical path, Herb, from site specificity to curatorial. I mean, there was a way, if you remember, on the kind of later end of site specificity in the late 90s and 2000s, there was that shift from physical site to discursive site. So people like Mark Dion and Fred Wilson were kind of coming to the fore, who were dealing with kind of institutional history, in Fred Wilson's case with Mining the Museum, and kind of discursive terrains in Mark Dion's case with his ecological environmental works. And I think that that shift, that kind of evolution from the artist being in his or her studio to an artist responding to a physical site, to an artist responding to a kind of institutional frame and kind of discursive terrain, that actually logically led many people, not just me, from a studio-based practice to a sited practice or a sculptural practice to an academic and a curatorial practice. And in fact, if we move a couple of slides ahead, that was also the time when independent curators like Hans-Ulrich Obrist were really having their day in the sun. You know, which really on the left-hand side is okay, and this is, well, I think many people will know this project that Obrist did called Do It, this book, curatorial project, come book, that he did. On the left-hand side, we're looking at a slide of Green Lantern, which was a collective in Chicago. And many years later with Megha Rolapati, I co-curated a show at the Hyde Park Art Center where we found this old exhibition of Green Lantern and asked them to reinstall it at the Hyde Park Art Center. And so that's what we're looking at on the left-hand side. But these independent curators at the time, I mean, now we maybe laugh at them and think that, you know, they were pursuing star curatorhood, but we have to remember at the time, you know, the field of curating was probably one of the more exciting arenas, right, in art. You know, when you were at Exit, right? Like when you were at Exit Art, you know, the exhibitions there were kind of really cutting edge. I mean, the exhibition itself, not just the work being shown in the exhibition, right? The format of the exhibitions. And these are just some examples of shows that I did. I wouldn't necessarily do them now, but at the, you know, because they seem too interventionist, the curatorial hand seems too strong. But, you know, on the upper right, you know, this was with Sarah Reisman, this kind of bridge that cut across Dumbo. On the left, Microviews with Mukhtar Kokash and Stephen Apicella Hitchcock, which were all of the artists from that LMCC residency program before 9/11, you know, were part of this exhibition. On the right, some crazy project at Scope with Bill Previty and Andrea Salerno. And on the left, a project up in Maine. So these were kind of very interventionist curatorial projects that I think were part of that era of independent curating.
I love how you wove in all of that, Chris, to kind of arrive at your own artistic practice and how you called it kind of the discursive space and sort of being able to work sort of outside the studio or post-studio, I guess a lot of people call it. But just going back to curating, because I want to just stay on this and kind of acknowledge a question from Sophia Ma, who asked about your curatorial practice. And I just wonder, with all you've done in curating, and I get asked this question a lot, and I don't really know how to answer it the best way, but like, what's the most important thing that makes for a good curator in your mind?
I think I would answer the question now differently than I probably would have answered when the project's on screen, when I did the projects on screen. I mean, now for me, a curator's role is really to be the facilitator and aid to best showcase an artist and an artist's work. I mean, I really think it's far more of a responsible and background position. I think at the time, I was enamored with the transformations in the field of curating. And so I would have argued that curating, again, this is back in the 2000s, that curating was, and I kind of still believe this, it's the one practice that acknowledges that artwork is not only radical, right? I think that we have, of course, in the West, this notion that artwork is always subversive and radical and on the margins and outside of the main. Curating was a way of working with that, but also always with this idea of becoming institutional, right? Just by sheer dint of the fact that a work is being curated into an exhibition or collected by a museum, by an institution, it has this idea of a work also being half out, half on the margins, but halfway in. And actually that kind of mediating position of curating is one that I still believe in. I don't even in art practice believe that it's entirely beyond the frame or subversive, right? I think that this kind of half in, half out position is more useful and frankly more realistic. Does that make sense? That was really complicated. That was like a really long answer.
No, it makes total sense to me. I kind of see it the same way as the curator being a kind of bridge for audiences to help understand, help kind of clarify, help unpack some of the ideas that, some of the very complex ideas that artists have, and some of the references that I think aren't obvious, you know, to a lot of audiences. So definitely, I totally, you know, I love that answer. I wanted to, I'm just trying to look for like the right next question here. So, because we're kind of like, I'm just looking at the time too, but, and we have some audience questions I want to get to. And actually, for those of you that are out there, you know, if you have questions for Chris, please type them into either the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll try to get to them. I guess one last question for me before we go into the audience questions is just going back to kind of like the beginning and talking about Hong Kong again. You know, where you spent a lot of time as a child. Now I wonder what your relationship is to Hong Kong. You know, do you go back much, and you know, how do you see it now, and how different is it than when you were growing up?
You know, I do go back a lot. There was a time, I think between, well, in college and immediately after that, I went back only about once every other year. But in my adult life, or more recently, I've gone back a lot, COVID aside. And I've actually thought very seriously since 2017 about moving back. New York has seemed less and less attractive. And of course, you know, with our last president and even the violence that we're seeing against Asian Americans now, it really does make me question whether people with Black hair, people like us, will ever be fully at home. You know, if the U.S. is welcoming, and will it ever be welcoming, or is this just kind of the carrot, that this kind of ever receding goal for Asian Americans that won't be achievable? So, you know, for me, Hong Kong is a place where, you know, I don't have to think about that. I still consider it home. I don't know if you do. I know you grew up in San Francisco. You know, you were born in Hong Kong as well. But it's my other home. Let's put it that way. So I do feel like it's a very promising place. And also the art there, let's face it, is amazing, right? I mean, a lot of the best work I've seen in the past couple of years, I've seen in Hong Kong. So I think it's worth following, right? For people in the arts. So yeah, Neil, these are just Hawaii. We don't need to look at these. I think these are, we can speak.
Oh, I mean,
read a lot.
Yeah, I mean, just to go through
we don't have to.
other, but I do want to bring up because we talked a lot about curating, but and there's this project to talk about too, but just to go through some recent projects that are very memorable. At Y Gallery, a show called Demoiselle
Davignon.
Davignon. Yeah, that was a really that was an incredible project for me. And then I think a few years before, a show that included like a huge picture of Bill Clinton and somebody else from Dawson's Creek and a lot of other elements. Yeah, I mean, maybe you can just like talk a little bit about sort of your artistic process now and sort of how some of these projects kind of relate to this earlier idea that you're talking about of um, you know, how kind of you related to curating.
It's a great question. By the way, Ian Coffray is in the audience. Ian is the one who came up with Demoiselle d'Avignon as a title. He actually dared me. He said, I dare you to name a show after Picasso's 1907 work. And so when the opportunity came up, I decided to take him up on it. But in terms of the work now, I do feel like a lot of, you know, and Neil is showing a couple of diagrams that whatever I tend to do in terms of trying to map out the field of art and trying to trace or track where art moves, the direction that the field of art naturally is moving in. I feel like that is a kind of consistent goal in my teaching, as well as my art making, as well as my curatorial endeavors. There is a way that the field itself has its own biases and its own direction. And I know you know this too, because you're involved in the field. And I think that we can respond or acknowledge these directions in many ways, whether it's in the studio, in the classroom, or in a curatorial position, you know, just ways of thinking about the field as a whole.
Yeah, this is
so the right-hand diagram, for instance, is the most recent kind of picture of how the kind of field looks from 2017, and you know, it formed the basis of a number of seminars, but also an artwork, which is the next following slide to this, as well as some kind of more curatorial endeavors. So
yeah, you know, I think of your work sometimes like, you know, I often like to say that artists make, I think, sometimes the most interesting or the best historians. And when I say that, I often think of your work. And I, you know, I wonder for my last question, if you could just talk about your relationship to history. And you talked about your relationship to teaching, but just how do you understand, you know, history as it relates to your own work? Yeah.
It's a great question. I mean, I'm constantly trying to struggle with it too. For the students, for my former students in the audience now, I used to have to do this art history 101 course at RISD, which was atrocious for teaching, obviously, right? With 400 students and having to put together two lectures a week with slides. I mean, would never want to do this again, but I think putting together those lectures made me realize the malleability of history, number one. The number of ways you can recount the same story using the same objects. And also, it made me, I think, recognize the kind of two-way street that history is. And, you know, I think, you know, I remember very ambitiously telling my students that if they didn't like what they were listening to, they could make work that would realign the work that came behind it. You know, they could make work that would highlight works that came before them chronologically to highlight those works if they fell asleep during my art history class and complained afterwards, right? Like, I don't like what you're talking about. And I would just say, well, you reformulate it then. And so
Right.
I do think that that's still one of the, still a very powerful tool for contemporary artists and curators alike.
Now, I know I was going to get on to some audience questions, but there's still one thing I have left out asking you, and that's about the new book, Best Letters from Asian Americans in the Arts. It's just coming out now, and I think it's just like an incredibly timely project. So could you just talk about how that project came into being? It's co-edited with Daisy Nam, the curator. And yeah, would love to hear you talk about, how you guys thought about that and how you conceived of it.
Well, first of all, thank you, Herb, for your contribution to that book, which is amazing. And really provided amazing insights into the Museum of Chinese in America, as well as your own aspirations for it, for the organization, for the institution. Daisy Nam and I were part of essentially a reading group at Asia Art Archive in America called Leadership Camp. And it turned, fortuitously or not, the last session was about model minorities and model majorities. And so that is where we met. And that's actually where the seed of the book emerged from, is the discussions we had among the reading group's participants about what it meant for us, as almost everyone was a kind of young Asian American in the arts, what it meant for us kind of encountering this model minority myth and the ways that we acceded to it as well as exceeded it. And I think that the book came from the recognition that this myth was past due, which I think we can all agree on now, and to start articulating or hearing from arts workers how they might exceed the parameters of this model minority myth.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to getting my copy and kind of reading the other.
Me too. COVID be damned for holding things up.
Well, yeah, it only like makes me want it more now. So I wanted to.
It's at the printers, so it's whenever whenever they can turn this darn thing around.
Yeah, and then whenever UPS or whoever can ship it out, which is another big question mark.
Exactly.
Can you take some audience questions, Chris?
I would love to. I would very much love to. I can't see anyone, so you may have to read out questions.
Read it out. I'll read it out to you. So the first one's from an anonymous attendee who asked that a few of your pieces have a Thanksgiving turkey in them. Any affinity for Thanksgiving or turkey? Or is it purely?
No, I would much rather have a roasted duck any day, believe me. But that's such a good question. I can't even answer. I have no idea how that happened. I mean, I do, but it's not my answers are not good ones.
Okay. But it's probably like the right motif at the time, right?
Exactly, the right motif about like Americana, kind of encapsulated American, an American ritual. But really, the answers aren't that good. I would much rather have a roasted duck.
Yeah, I mean, just staying on this a little bit more, like the themes that you often circle around do have to do a lot. I feel with like the promise of America. The promises of certain generations of an American idealism, whether it be multiculturalism or something to do with modernism, maybe even. I mean, can you talk about like America just as a concept for you as subject matter?
Hmm. It's a tough one. Yes, I am interested in the promise of American exceptionalism. I'm also dubious about it, and I think coming from an art perspective, especially going back to Ms. Reed, a formalist arts perspective, I tend to look at ideologies or ideals like American exceptionalism, both in terms of their content, but also in terms of their form. So, you know, American exceptionalism and American ideals are so prevalent in part because historically, of course, America, you know, was a ever expanding westward country that didn't necessarily have to deal with the pragmatics of defending its borders the way that older European nation states did. And so in some ways, that is why America is allowed to be idealistic, right? Now, I think that if you look at it that way and then compare it to maybe other countries, not just European nation states, but something like China, like empires like China, Russia, I think structurally and formally, those, if we use Chinese exceptionalism as a frame, that would kind of change the, almost like change the atmosphere, right?
Yeah.
For all activities, including making art, right? Making art that deals with ideals or whatnot. And so in part, I'm interested in American exceptionalism and kind of American Northeastern, the ethos of Northeastern American elites, like in privileged white people, that multiculturalism from the 90s, in part because I want to make them a little bit more opaque, if that makes sense. You know, they're so transparent and invisible because we don't necessarily historicize them. We don't necessarily look at them formally. We don't necessarily compare them to other kinds of exceptionalisms. So I think making those a little bit more opaque would be helpful. Well, I don't know if it would be helpful, but it's certainly an interesting project.
Totally, and that's what I mean by, definitely. That's what I mean by, I feel like artists like you make the most interesting historians. Is I think historians tend to tell a linear story. They tend to sort of you know, try to reduce things down to cause and effect, and they look at sort of like these big waves, big movements, and I think artists are sort of masters at the gaps, the gray areas, the kind of untold stories, and also, yeah, the idea of like making it more opaque and less clear. I think that's an interesting way to look at, you know, storytelling, actually.
Spoken like an artist yourself, Herb.
I wish.
You
All right,
are.
I want to get to another question by a real artist. Okay, Harley Greco, wonderful young artist, who asks, "What role do publications play in your art and curatorial practice, especially with ephemeral and site-specific work?"
A great question. So an early aspiration after Hotchkiss, but you know, kind of before grad school, before kind of entering into becoming a more studio-based practice. My dream was actually to edit or found a journal. You know, you know, now of course, like print media sounds hilarious and it's not, you know, oh, right, like who would want to do that? But yeah, I find writing to be very useful in thinking through ideas. And often I think both writing and diagramming, those are my two go-to tools, are what would be equivalent to another artist, possibly, you know, Harley himself, another artist sketching.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, and I can see that in your work. Sometimes like the charts that you draw, really make it into the um, into the final piece and project, which I mean to me gets me thinking about pedagogy or theories and the practice of education for you seem really important. You talked about your teaching earlier, and I wonder um, about that part of you. Teaching and how important it is to you, and kind of what your sort of uh, mentality and thinking around teaching art in 2021 is.
I mean, I taught and teach for entirely selfish reasons. Meaning students, young people are so, they're so much smarter than me. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they're so much more
Yeah.
really in touch with what's going on in the field. Had I not taught, I would be making minimalist sculpture in 2021. In all seriousness, right? I learned far more from my
Hmm.
students. I have learned far more from my students than the other way around. It's entirely for selfish reasons. I mean, I can get into like teaching philosophy. Of course, I have a teaching philosophy and so on and so forth. But really, if you ask me the kind of motivation for doing it, it's that young people are smart.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
Yeah.
so much more on it than you and me, right?
Totally. Yeah. We need that to invigorate our own practice. I feel like to keep up almost, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I want to ask a final question of you, and it is revolving around curating. Um, I'm really like excited about um, that part of you in the past, and I wonder, kind of like I haven't seen you do shows recently. Are you planning some, or is there a reason why you've stopped doing them more recently?
You know, it's primarily a time thing. Once in a while, there are shows that I would like to do. Actually, there is a show I would love to do that um, has to do with that early kind of Brewster Project stuff. I feel like there was a moment when you were around, Herb, when we first met. Those early site-specific works, because they were ephemeral, they didn't necessarily get preserved in the way that a
Yeah.
collectible would be preserved. But also at the time, this was pre-Instagram, and so they were also not documented well. And so there is this interesting gap from the late 90s to the I would even say mid 2000s,
Mm.
of really interesting art that never quite made it into the history books. And
Hmm.
a lot of them are peers, right? They're friends of mine
Yeah.
who just kind of didn't quite make it. So yeah, there are exhibitions I'd love to do. It's mostly a time thing,
Yeah.
right? I mean, teaching plus art making. I mean, art making is such a pain in the butt. Let's face it.
Well, I mean, you're one of the artists I really admire for your rigor,
Thank
and I
you.
really appreciated this conversation. I feel like I could have gone on another couple hours, and we still wouldn't be satisfied with all the with what's left. But one thing I'd like to ask before at the end of an oral history is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
That's a great, wow. Again, thank you. I've never been asked that question.
I don't want to leave anything out.
Oh, I mean, I would love to open it up to a conversation. I know this is Museum of Chinese in America, and just to go back to how you started, Herb,
Mm.
with Asian Americans, not necessarily by choice, being
Yeah.
visible, very visible, how to handle it and respond to it as a arts organization, which has to do often with visual culture. You know,
Mm.
of course a different kind of visibility, because I think we're visible when we walk down the street. But yeah, I'm. But this is more a conversation. I mean, I have no idea. But I would love to just open that up to the audience and to you
Yeah.
and to Neil.
Yeah. Thanks. Right. I would love to hear what Neil thinks. You know, we met this morning for another reason as a staff, and you know, spent most of the time talking about the two videos that you know, were released yesterday. That a lot of people saw yesterday's somebody being beaten, you know, violently on the subway, and then an older woman, I think she's Filipino, who was, you know, kicked outside of a building, and it was captured on surveillance camera. And yeah, it's like, uh, I was saying this to you before, but I don't know how to even begin to unpack all of this, you know, and just personally, and then as a museum, um, you know, what we can do to help, you know, and I think we all are like, what can we as an institution do that is like within our mission, within our scope, that is doable and is actually helpful, and not just, you know, um, and we're not just sort of performing the act of being sympathetic or whatever, but how to be helpful. So I don't, you know, I would love to hear ideas too. You know, we've done reading clubs where we tried to unpack the ideas of the model minority myth, and sort of, you know, um, and tried to understand and have people talk about their own experiences with anti-Asian racism and violence. And I think that helps to creating that space, safe space where people can share and share resources and share ideas, and just kind of be feeling like they're part of a community of people who also are feeling the same complex emotions. That I think is helpful in itself. But yeah, we would love to hear about ideas of what more we could do as an institution. So yeah, I appreciate that opportunity to kind of like reflect on that, and help us problem solve. But we're all like, um, you know, really wondering ourselves too.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for this. Thank you for this conversation.
No, it's been amazing, and you know, like, Chris, I really appreciate it, and you know, I really feel like it just seemed like not that long ago that I met you for the first time, and all of a sudden it's been like 20 something years, and just seeing everything you've done and just following your career. Uh, you know, I feel heartened that somebody like you, with your, again, rigor, you know, you're really like a kind of model for me and what I do, and I think for, you know, a lot of like younger artists and curators out there, definitely should be following up on what you've done. So really appreciate it, Chris.
Well, thank you so much. That really means a lot. That really does. So thank you very, very much. And hopefully for those who may have asked questions, I can't really see the questions, but for those who asked questions and perhaps Herb and I didn't get to them, maybe Neil can also bump them over to me, and I can answer them, you know, by email or whatever,
Yeah.
some other time. But thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for asking questions also that typically I'm not asked. So it was also really exciting for me. And I know
Yeah.
that MOCA is embarking on a lot of new and interesting, a new and major phase. So I also am very much looking forward to what MOCA will be and is becoming in the next couple of years.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll have a lot more conversation about that with you, and hopefully with a lot more people. But thanks again, Chris. And you know, hopefully we'll see each other in person soon. If not, you know, I'll look out for you.
Sounds amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for attending as well. So,
Definitely. Thanks everybody for joining, and see you at the next program.
see you.
Bye, everybody.